I'll never forget that night, the one that still haunts my dreams. I was driving home late, returning from a business trip. The sun had already set, and the headlights of my car were the only source of light on the empty, desolate stretch of highway. It was one of those long, rural roads, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever with barely any signs of life. There were no gas stations, no diners, no houses, just miles of asphalt cutting through dark, dense forests. I've always been a night owl, so driving at this hour wasn't unusual for me. But what happened that night, well, it changed everything. The road was quiet, almost too quiet. I didn't see a single car for miles. I was starting to feel a little uneasy, but I brushed it off. The radio wasn't even working properly, only a few crackling stations and static, adding to the eerie silence that filled the car. I couldn't help but notice that the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch and sway unnaturally, even though there was no wind. It was like they were watching me, waiting for something. But that wasn't the worst part. As I drove on, I began to notice something strange. A car had appeared behind me. I hadn't seen it pull up, and I hadn't heard its engine. It was a black sedan, but I didn't catch the make or model. I tried to ignore it, but the car kept tailing me. He's never getting too close, but always staying just a few car lengths behind. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us, but the sedan matched my pace. No matter how fast I went, it kept right there, like it was glued to my bumper. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just a coincidence, right? Maybe the other driver was heading in the same direction. But something didn't sit right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The sedan was too persistent, and it wasn't behaving like a normal driver. I had no choice but to pull over at a rundown rest stop. It was barely more than a few cracked benches and a faded sign warning about wildlife. But it was something, at least. I needed a break, and I thought maybe I could wait for the car to pass. I parked my car and watched the sedan slow down as it approached. My heart skipped a beat as it stopped behind me. I thought it was just going to keep going, but no. The driver's side door opened. I couldn't see the driver, but I could hear footsteps crunching in the gravel. That's when I panicked. I locked my doors and quickly looked around for a way to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The road was empty, and the rest stop wasn't exactly the safest place to be stuck at night. Then the sound came. It was a loud knock on my window. I froze, barely breathing, my hands clutched tightly to the steering wheel. I turned my head slowly to the left, looking at the window. The figure standing outside was tall and thin, cloaked in darkness. They were wearing a long black jacket, their face obscured by the shadows, but I could feel their gaze piercing through the glass. "Roll down your window," the figure said, his voice soft but cold. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, and my mind was racing. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but there was no one around for miles. I had no idea who this person was, what they wanted, or if they had anything to do with the strange car behind me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of there, but the fear held me in place. The figure knocked again, more urgently this time. I said, "Roll down your window," he repeated, his voice more forceful. I was too terrified to respond. I wanted to drive off, but I couldn't. It was as if something had taken hold of me. My fingers shook as I slowly reached for the door lock and then for the window button. My mind screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't. Something about the figure outside, the way he stood there, unmoving yet somehow intimidating, made it feel like I had no choice but to do what he said. The window rolled down with a soft, whirring sound, and the chill of the night air rushed in. I could now see the figure more clearly. He was tall, unnaturally so, his skin pale like he hadn't seen the light of day in years. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and they didn't blink. They were completely black, empty, soulless voids. His lips were drawn tight, barely a slit in his face, but I could hear his breath, shallow and ragged. "You're not from here," he said, his words coming out in a low hiss. I didn't know how to respond. My body was still shaking, my mind racing. "I'm just passing through," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. "Then you'll leave, but not before you see what's waiting for you," he replied cryptically. Before I could ask what he meant, he stepped back and turned toward the sedan, but not in the normal way. It was as if his body twisted unnaturally, like something was wrong with the way he moved. His movements were jerky, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. The figure opened the car door, and that's when I saw it. A pale, gaunt hand emerged from the sedan's front seat, reaching for the figure. It was like something from a nightmare. The hand looked decayed, with grayish skin stretched tight over brittle bones. The fingers were elongated, unnaturally long, and the nails were jagged like claws. It gripped the doorframe tightly, and the figure pulled it toward him. For a moment, I thought I saw something even worse. A face, pale and twisted, peering out from the shadows inside the car. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth curled into a sinister grin. I slammed the car into gear, my foot pressing down hard on the accelerator. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely focus on the road ahead. I sped off, not daring to look in the rearview mirror, but I could feel their presence, as if they were still watching me. The rest of the drive was a blur, my hands clenched on the wheel, my eyes darting nervously between the road and the dark forest on either side. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the trees, shadowy figures watching from the darkness. The feeling of being followed never left me. I kept expecting to see that black sedan in my rearview mirror, but it never came. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that wasn't human. I finally made it to the nearest town, my hands trembling as I pulled into the first gas station I saw. I quickly parked and rushed inside, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. The attendant at the counter looked at me with concern. "Are you all right, sir? You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed, but it wasn't funny. I shook my head, trying to push the memory of what I'd seen out of my mind. There was something on the highway, a man, and something else. I don't know what it was. It was wrong. The attendant stared at me for a long moment, his face pale. Then he lowered his voice and said, "You're lucky you got out. People have gone missing on that road. Strange things happen out there, and some say the place is cursed." I didn't need to hear anymore. I paid quickly and left, still shaken, still trying to understand what had happened. I've never been able to forget that night, and I've never driven down that highway again. I don't know who or what I encountered, but whatever it was, I'm sure it wasn't human. If you're ever traveling late at night and you find yourself on a long stretch of empty highway, be careful. You might not be alone. You might think you're just seeing things, but trust me, the truth is far worse.
Next story.
It was a dark, quiet night when I decided to drive back home from a visit to my friend's house. I had been there for hours, and by the time I left, the roads were nearly empty, just me and the occasional car speeding past. It was one of those cold, eerie nights where the fog crept in low, swallowing up the road ahead of me. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, and even though I had a full tank of gas, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease gnawing at me. I was traveling down a desolate stretch of highway, a road that I had taken countless times before, but tonight it felt different. The trees on either side of the road loomed like dark sentinels, their branches tangled above, blocking out what little light there was. The wind howled through the gaps in the branches, a mournful sound that made me clutch the steering wheel a little tighter. The radio was nothing but static, no matter how much I twisted the dial. I tried humming along to the songs I knew, but it didn't help. The silence inside my car felt oppressive, as if something was waiting for me. I reached the point on the highway where there's a long stretch of nothingness. No gas stations, no houses, just miles of uninterrupted road and forest. Normally I'd feel okay, comfortable even, but tonight I felt watched. And not in the usual way. This was different. There was a heaviness in the air, something that made my skin crawl. That's when I saw it. A figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, maybe some animal or a shadow, but no. This was different. It was a woman standing by the side of the highway, illuminated only by the headlights of my car. She was wearing a long white dress, her hair wild and tangled, her face pale and gaunt. She didn't move, just stood there, staring straight ahead. I slowed down instinctively, my foot coming off the gas as I got closer. Something about the way she stood there, in the middle of nowhere, gave me chills. I didn't stop. I couldn't. As I passed her, I glanced in the rearview mirror. To my horror, she was still standing there, watching me as if she knew I was looking. Her eyes, empty, hollow, seemed to pierce through me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I pushed my foot back on the gas, speeding away, desperately trying to put distance between me and that strange figure. But the feeling of being watched never left. The trees on either side of the highway seemed to close in on me as I sped down the road. My headlights illuminated nothing but a thick, rolling fog ahead. I felt like I was driving in a dream, or worse, a nightmare, unable to escape the strange presence that had settled in the car with me. I tried to shake it off. It was just a woman, I told myself. Maybe she was lost, or maybe it was just some kind of weird coincidence. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The highway seemed longer than usual, stretching out into an endless blackness, and the air grew colder, more oppressive. I glanced again at the rearview mirror, expecting to see the woman again, but the road behind me was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. Minutes passed, but the tension in the air only grew. And then, as I rounded a bend in the road, I saw her again. She was standing there on the side of the highway, just like before, except this time her figure was clearer. Her eyes were wide open, and I could swear she was grinning in a way that made my blood run cold. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt, my heart in my throat. The woman didn't move. She simply stood there, watching me. I should have driven past. I should have ignored her, kept going, but something compelled me to stop. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. But I rolled down my window, just a crack. "Are you okay?" I called out into the darkness, my voice shaking. The woman didn't answer. She just tilted her head slightly, as if studying me. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and her skin was deathly pale. There was something wrong with her, something otherworldly. I could feel it deep in my bones. Before I could say anything else, a flash of movement caught my eye. My gaze snapped to the road ahead, and I saw something that froze me in place. It was a car, an old beat-up vehicle, barreling toward me at an impossible speed. My heart raced as the car came closer, its headlights blinding, and for a brief moment I thought I was going to be run over. But as quickly as the car appeared, it vanished. Just like that. 1 second it was there, and the next, it was gone. I stared ahead, in disbelief, my heart pounding in my chest. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of hallucination? But then, I looked back at the woman. She was gone. I scanned the side of the highway, searching the fog for any sign of her, but she was nowhere to be found. For a split second, I felt a fleeting sense of relief, but that relief quickly turned to dread. The air had changed again. The cold was biting, and I felt an icy presence creeping into the car. It wasn't over. Whatever that woman was, she wasn't going to let me go that easily. As I continued to drive, my headlights flickered, and the radio crackled back to life with static, the eerie sound filling the car. I glanced at the dashboard. The clock had stopped. It was 3:07 a.m. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stuck in some kind of loop, that I had crossed into a place where time didn't work the same way, where things didn't follow the rules. A few miles down the road, the fog cleared, and the trees seemed to thin out. I looked ahead and saw a small town in the distance, lights flickering in the darkness. It was a relief to see civilization again. But as I neared the town, I saw something else in the distance, a sign that read, "Dead Man's Curve." I had never seen that sign before. I slowed the car, uncertain of what to do, but my eyes were drawn to the road, to the dark stretch that twisted ahead, sharp and winding. As I approached, I could see something moving in the corner of my vision, something in the rearview mirror. It was her again, the woman in the white dress. This time, she was no longer standing by the side of the road. She was in the middle of the highway, right in front of me, walking slowly toward the car. My heart thudded in my chest as I slammed my foot on the brake, coming to a screeching halt just inches away from her. She was closer than ever now, her face twisted into an expression that was no longer human, her smile wide and grotesque. She leaned in toward the windshield, her eyes hollow, and whispered in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices at once, "You shouldn't have stopped." And with that, she disappeared. I sat frozen in my seat, trembling, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The radio crackled again, and this time it wasn't static. I could hear something. No, someone, laughing. It was a low, guttural laugh, coming from the darkness from the trees lining the road. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the highway, faster and faster, desperate to get away. My mind raced as I thought about everything I had just witnessed. The woman, the car, the eerie laughter, and all I could do was drive as fast as I could into the unknown. I never looked back.
Next story.
I was a young journalist, eager to prove myself, when I was assigned to write a piece on a strange phenomenon that had been reported along Highway 81. It was an isolated stretch of road winding through the dense woods of North Carolina, and locals had been whispering about it for years. Strange disappearances, mysterious lights in the sky, and eerie sounds at night. Stories that seemed like nothing more than urban legends. I was skeptical, of course. My job was to uncover the truth, not get swept up in superstitions. It was a cold November evening when I drove out to the highway to investigate. The setting sun cast a pale glow over the landscape, and the trees seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The quietness of the area was unsettling. There was no traffic, no people, just miles of road disappearing into the darkening woods. As I made my way down the highway, I thought about the stories I'd heard. One of the most popular rumors was about a woman in white said to appear on the side of the road, asking for a ride. The story went that if you picked her up, she would lead you into the forest, where you'd vanish without a trace, and no one would ever see you again. It sounded absurd, like something out of a bad horror movie, but the stories persisted. There were enough first-hand accounts to make me think there was something to it. My mind wandered as I drove, the low hum of the tires on the road the only sound in the air. I felt an uneasy chill, a sense that I wasn't alone, but I dismissed it as my overactive imagination. I had just passed an old, abandoned gas station when I saw her. She was standing by the side of the road, just a figure in the fading light, wearing a long white dress. At first, I thought it was just some kind of mirage, or maybe a prank, but as I got closer, I realized she was real. She was barefoot, her long hair flowing around her face, and her eyes seemed to glow faintly, though I couldn't make out any real details in the dimming light. She raised her hand as if to flag me down. I slowed my car, my instinct telling me to keep going. My mind screamed, "It's just another story. Don't stop. Don't be foolish." But my curiosity got the better of me. I stopped just a few feet away and I rolled down the window. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice suddenly feeling small against the vast emptiness of the woods surrounding us. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at me, her eyes so intense that I felt like she could see straight into my soul. The silence stretched on for a few seconds before she finally spoke. "I need your help." Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Please, take me home." I was hesitant. There was something off about her, something that didn't sit right, but I couldn't bring myself to drive off, not when someone was asking for help. "Where do you need to go?" I asked. "Just down the road," she said, pointing in the direction I was already heading. I hesitated for a moment longer, but then I unlocked the passenger side door. The woman stepped into the car with an eerie grace, her bare feet barely touching the ground. As soon as she sat down, I noticed how cold the air had become. It wasn't just the typical chill of nightfall. It was as though the temperature had dropped drastically and the fog had started to roll in. I glanced over at her, but she was staring straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap, almost as though she was waiting for something. Her presence in the car was overwhelming, like she was somehow filling the entire space. The silence between us stretched on, thick and suffocating. "You never said where you're going?" I said, trying to break the tension. "What's your name?" She didn't respond. I tried again, louder this time. "What's your name?" Still nothing. The road ahead of us seemed to grow darker, the trees on either side closing in like looming shadows. The fog thickened, wrapping around the car like a heavy blanket. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It's only been 5 minutes. It felt like hours. I tried to keep my focus on the road, but there was something in the air, something wrong. The closer we got to the woods, the more I felt like I was being pulled deeper into something I couldn't see but could definitely feel. I was sure of it now. She wasn't just asking for a ride. She had something else in mind. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked again, my voice trembling now. She finally turned her head to look at me, and when she did, my blood ran cold. Her eyes were black, not a shade of brown or deep blue, just black. Empty, hollow eyes, like an abyss staring back at me. "I told you," she whispered. "Just keep driving." Before I could say anything else, the car began to slow on its own, as though the engine had lost power. I pressed the gas pedal, but it wouldn't move. The car was stuck in place. "What's happening?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. She didn't answer. Her face remained eerily calm, her eyes locked onto mine. And then I heard it. The sound of something shifting in the woods. A low, guttural sound, like an animal dragging itself through the underbrush. It was a sound that shouldn't have been possible, and yet it was there, unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned the key in the ignition again, desperately trying to get the car moving, but it was no use. The woman suddenly leaned toward me, her cold breath washing over my face. "You shouldn't have picked me up," she said, her voice low and ominous. "Now you'll never leave." A sharp, piercing noise, like the scream of something in agony, suddenly filled the air, shaking the car, making the windows rattle in their frames. I looked out the window and my breath caught in my throat. The woods around me were alive, no longer silent, no longer still. Figures, dark and twisted, moved between the trees, their eyes glowing faintly, their forms shifting and warping in the fog. They were coming for me. The woman's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a kind one. It was cold, predatory. Before I could scream, she was gone. The car lurched forward as if nothing had happened. The fog lifted and the night air returned to its normal temperature. The road ahead of me was empty, the trees now silent. I looked around in a daze, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. The woman, the figures in the woods, the noises. I drove away quickly, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I never stopped again, not once. And when I finally made it back to civilization, I found myself questioning everything. I knew what I had seen, what had happened, but I also knew that I couldn't explain it. Not to anyone. The next day, I did some research. There were no official records of any missing persons on Highway 81, but there were rumors. Rumors of a woman who vanished decades ago, a woman who had been lost in the woods and never found. Maybe it was her. Maybe she was the one who had come to find me. I still don't know, but I'll never drive down Highway 81 again.
Next story.
It was a late fall night, the kind where the air has a crisp bite and the stars twinkle like scattered diamonds against the blackened sky. I had been on the road for hours, driving through the backcountry of Arkansas, trying to make my way home to Little Rock after a visit to my sister. The trip had been uneventful, just the usual stretches of empty highway and the occasional diner or gas station. The kind of drive where you could lose yourself in thought, the hum of the tires and the radio in the background. Around midnight, I found myself on Highway 49, a quiet two-lane road that cut through miles of dense forest. The headlights of my car barely pierced the thick canopy of trees lining the road, and the only sound was the low rumble of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. It was peaceful, if a bit lonely. That's when I saw it, a figure on the side of the road, standing completely still. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively slowed down. I figured it was someone in trouble, maybe a stranded driver or a hitchhiker. But when I got closer, I noticed something strange. The figure wasn't moving, not even slightly, just standing there, completely motionless under a large oak tree. It was a man, dressed in an old, tattered brown coat with a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. I could barely make out any features except for the faint outline of his hands, clutching something at his side. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should stop and offer help, but something about the scene gave me a sense of unease. My gut was telling me to drive on, but my curiosity won out. I pulled over slowly, the tires crunching on the gravel as I stopped a few feet away from him. My window was cracked just enough for the cold air to seep in, and I called out to him. "Hey, are you all right?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then, he slowly turned his head, and I froze. The man's face was pale, almost sickly, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. There was something unnatural about the way he looked at me, like he wasn't really seeing me at all. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy and low. "You shouldn't have stopped." I couldn't explain it, but the words sent a chill down my spine. Something about the way he said it felt wrong, like a warning, but not one meant for my safety. I asked again, my voice shaky, "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he took a step toward me, his movements unnervingly slow. The rustling of his coat sounded like dry leaves in the wind. I could see now that his hands were clasped around something, a bundle wrapped in what looked like old, faded cloth. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but all I could focus on were those empty eyes. "Turn around," he said suddenly, his voice sharp now. "Turn around and don't look back." Before I could react, the man began to walk toward the woods, still clutching the bundle. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he was waiting for something, or someone. I didn't know why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to listen to him. I started the car without a second thought and sped off, my tires kicking up gravel as I turned the wheel hard to get back onto the highway. The road stretched ahead of me, dark and empty, but my mind was racing. Who was that man? And why did he say those words to me? I told myself it was nothing, that I had just spooked myself. But as I continued down the road, something started to feel wrong. The air seemed to thicken around me, the trees growing darker, almost like they were closing in on the road. The faint glow from my headlights barely reached the trees on either side, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head, telling myself I was just tired. But that's when I saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road, just like before. This time it wasn't a man. It was a woman. Her long black hair flowed down her back like a veil, and she was wearing a white dress, but it looked old, faded, and stained with something dark. She was standing in the same spot, under the same oak tree, as though she hadn't moved since I passed her earlier. My heart began to race again, and I could feel a bead of sweat trickling down the side of my face, despite the cold. I slowed down, and as I did, I noticed something even more unsettling. Her eyes, dark, empty eyes, just like the man's, were staring straight at me. I don't know why I did it, but I pulled over again, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I tried to tell myself I was just being irrational, that it was just some random woman who needed help, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. I called out to her. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. Not at first, but then she took a step toward my car, her eyes locked on mine, and her lips parted in a smile, except it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a wide, eerie grin stretching unnaturally across her face. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said, her voice just as cold and hollow as the man's had been. My blood ran cold and panic set in. I slammed the car into reverse, my heart pounding in my chest as I sped away. But this time, I didn't feel any relief. I could feel something in the back of my mind, something that whispered that this was just the beginning. I drove for what felt like hours, the road winding through the dark woods, but every time I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw them. The figures, standing at the edge of the trees watching me. Their faces were always obscured by shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me, burning through the night. Eventually, I made it to a small town, my hands still shaking as I pulled into a gas station. I got out of the car, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself. The attendant, an older man with a gray beard, looked at me curiously as I approached the counter. "You all right, kid?" he asked, noting the panic in my eyes. I don't know," I muttered, trying to gather myself. "I think I saw something on the road, a man and then a woman. They said I shouldn't have stopped." The attendant's face went pale. "You saw them?" I nodded, confused. "What do you mean?" He swallowed hard, leaning closer. "You're not the first one. Those people, they've been seen on that stretch of road for decades. No one really knows who they are or what they want. But there's an old legend. They say if you stop for them, you'll never leave. Not really." My heart sank. I didn't want to believe it, but in that moment, I knew something had happened, something I couldn't explain, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I left the gas station, my mind reeling. I don't know if it was the road, the people, or something else that I'll never understand, but I can tell you this: if you ever find yourself on Highway 49, especially at night, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back.
Next story.
It was an unusually warm October evening when I found myself on Route 13, a long, desolate highway that ran through the vast farmlands of Southern Virginia. I had been driving for hours, with nothing but the steady hum of my car and the occasional flicker of headlights from other cars speeding past. My destination was a small, quiet cabin my friend had rented for a weekend getaway, a much-needed break from the noise of city life. I had heard rumors about Route 13, how it was known for being eerie, and how some drivers claimed to have had strange experiences along it. But I brushed it off as just local superstition. People love their ghost stories, right? This wasn't the kind of thing I believed in. It was a perfectly normal highway, after all, just a little longer and a little less traveled. As the sun dipped behind the horizon and the sky turned dark, I could see a flicker of orange light in the distance. At first, I thought it might be the reflection of my headlights on a nearby sign or a barn, but as I got closer, I realized it was coming from the side of the road. There, in the middle of nowhere, a bonfire was burning. There were no other cars around, no houses, nothing that would explain why a fire would be blazing in such a remote spot. I slowed down, intrigued but cautious. It seemed odd. People didn't usually light fires in the middle of a highway unless they had some sort of emergency. Curiosity got the best of me, so I pulled over a little ways ahead of the fire. I left the engine running and the lights on, just in case I needed to get out of there quickly. I didn't know why, but the fire made me feel uneasy. It wasn't like the cozy campfires you might see at a picnic area or on a beach. This fire was bigger, almost wild, burning fiercely in the middle of nowhere. I stood there for a few moments, staring at it, wondering if I should get out and check it out. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Only the empty road, the trees, and the quiet, flickering light of the fire. My pulse was thumping in my ears, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe I was just paranoid from the isolation of the road. But then the footsteps came again, louder this time. I turned to look at the fire one more time and saw a figure standing near it. A man, tall, wearing a dark, wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He was staring at the fire, not moving. Not a single twitch or sign of life except for his faint silhouette illuminated by the flames. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there as still as the night around him. Something about the whole situation felt off. A strange, chilling sensation crept up my spine. I had no idea who he was or why he was there, but I had this gut feeling that I should stay far away. I backed away slowly toward my car, keeping my eyes fixed on the figure, just in case he decided to approach me. As I reached my car, I quickly got in, locked the door, and started to drive away. I didn't dare take my eyes off the fire or the man standing near it. As I drove, I could still see the glow of the flames in the rearview mirror, growing smaller and smaller as I put distance between myself and that strange spot. But then, just as I thought I was in the clear, something happened. The road ahead of me seemed to twist, as if it was no longer the same one I had been driving on. The trees that lined the highway were suddenly closer together, and the landscape seemed more oppressive, darker. And then I saw it, a sign. It was old and worn, as though it had been there for decades. The letters were faded, but I could still make out the words, "Welcome to Lost Creek." I had never seen this town before. I had been driving for miles and had never noticed a place called Lost Creek. It wasn't on the map, and I was certain I had been on the right road all along. I must have driven past that sign at least 3 times, but somehow it had never appeared. The road began to narrow and the trees seemed to lean in closer. I felt a pit in my stomach as I realized that I didn't know where I was anymore. I hadn't seen any other cars for miles, and the houses, when I finally saw them, were old, run down, and abandoned. Everything felt wrong. I started to panic, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I drove faster. The trees grew so close that the branches brushed against the sides of the car, their gnarled fingers scraping the windows. The road stretched on endlessly, and no matter how much I sped up, the darkness seemed to deepen. Then, out of nowhere, the headlights illuminated something. A small shack, barely more than a dilapidated structure, with smoke billowing out of the roof. I could see shadows moving inside, faint figures. It was as if they were watching me, waiting. I slammed my foot on the brake and tried to reverse, but my car stalled. I tried starting it again, but nothing happened. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced at the shack and saw the door creak open. The man from the fire appeared again, standing in the doorway, His face was still hidden in the shadow of his hat, but I could hear his low, rasping voice. "You should never have come. It's too late now." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My hands shook as I tried to shift the car into gear, but the engine sputtered and died. Panic set in. The man stepped closer to the car, his figure growing larger in the headlights. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling. The operator's voice crackled through the phone. 911, what's your emergency?" I couldn't speak. The man was standing right outside the window now, his face still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel his presence pressing against me like a weight. The operator's voice came through again, but it sounded distorted, distant. Then, before I could even respond, the line went dead. I grabbed the door handle, ready to bolt, but something stopped me. The air felt thick, oppressive. The man's voice echoed again, closer this time. "Leave now, or you'll never leave at all." I didn't wait to see what he meant. I tore the door open and ran, leaving my car behind. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted into the woods, not knowing where I was going, but only desperate to get away from him and the place I'd stumbled into. Behind me, I could hear the rustle of movement, the soft, slow footsteps of someone, or something, following. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. But when I finally stopped and looked around, I saw a familiar road. The trees opened up, and the road stretched before me once again. The world had returned to normal. When I got to the nearest town, I was disoriented, exhausted, and covered in dirt and scratches. I asked around about Lost Creek, but no one had ever heard of it. The road signs, the shack, the man, all gone as if they had never existed. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I'll never drive that stretch of Route 13 again.
Next story.
I've always loved long drives. Something about the open road, the silence, and the freedom of traveling alone gave me a sense of peace. I was heading home from a weekend visit to my sister's place in another state, and it was around 2 a.m. when I found myself on one of those long, desolate highways that stretch for miles, lined only with trees and the occasional old barn. The kind of highway where, if your car breaks down, you're in big trouble. It had been raining for a while, and the roads were slick. The wipers squeaked as they moved across the windshield, and the headlights barely cut through the fog. I wasn't scared, but the darkness pressing in from all sides made me uneasy. I kept my eyes on the road, focusing on the occasional signs that promised next gas station 20 miles. I wasn't worried about running out of gas, but the isolation of the place started to get to me. As I rounded a bend, I noticed a figure standing at the side of the road. I almost didn't see him, but my headlights caught his silhouette just in time. A man, soaked to the bone, standing by a sign that read, "Scenic Overlook Ahead." His clothes were ragged, like he'd been out there for a while, and his face was pale, his features gaunt. I slowed down, thinking he might need help. I wasn't the type to stop for every hitchhiker or stranded motorist, but something about this man seemed different. Maybe it was the way he stood so still, or the unsettling feeling that hung in the air like a storm ready to break. My car slowed to a crawl as I approached him. I rolled down my window slightly, enough to speak, but not enough to let anyone reach inside. "Hey, you need a ride?" The man didn't immediately respond. His head tilted ever so slightly, like he was listening, or maybe considering whether or not to speak. After a long moment, he finally opened his mouth, but his voice sounded strange, not quite right. It was low, almost a growl. No, I'm fine." I was about to drive off, but something made me hesitate. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up, but I forced myself to ask one last thing. "Are you sure? You're standing out here in the rain? Do you need help?" The man's eyes met mine, and it was then that I realized something was terribly wrong. His pupils were completely black. No whites, just black. It wasn't the trick of the light or the shadow. It was as though his eyes were entirely empty, a cold, deep void staring back at me. And that's when I felt it, that sinking sensation in my stomach. "No," he said again, but his lips barely moved. His voice wasn't even coming from his mouth anymore. It felt like it was coming from inside my head, a whisper just out of reach. "But you will." I don't know why, but my foot moved to the gas pedal. I slammed it down, and my tires squealed as I sped off. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I drove faster, faster than I ever had before, my heart racing in my chest. I wanted to shake the image of that man out of my mind, but the more I tried to forget, the more I could feel something wrong. Something was following me. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the fear playing tricks on me, but as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw it. A dark figure standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't moving, but I knew it was the same man. His form was distorted, like he was being stretched and pulled by some invisible force. The blackness of his figure seemed to absorb all the light around it, and then he was gone, only to appear again, now directly behind me. The silhouette was unmistakable. I pushed the accelerator down even harder. The sound of my tires screeching echoed through the car, but no matter how fast I drove, that figure kept getting closer. I could hear my breath quickening, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My mind raced. What was this? Was it real? Was I going crazy? And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard a voice again, this time much clearer. It wasn't a whisper. It was sharp, urgent, like a command. Stop. It wasn't a plea. It was an order, a demand. I didn't stop. I couldn't. My body was shaking, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. I was speeding now, the speedometer inching toward 90 miles per hour, but the figure was right behind me, almost as if it was gliding through the air, getting closer and closer. Then it happened. The car suddenly jerked violently, as though I'd hit something. I screamed, slamming on the brakes, the car spinning out of control on the wet road. The world spun around me, everything blurred, and then silence. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. I just stared ahead, trying to collect myself. And when I finally looked around, when the shaking in my hands subsided enough for me to breathe again, that's when I saw it. The road was completely empty. No car, no man, just the sound of rain tapping against the car. The world was still. I don't know how long I sat there, but it felt like hours. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that I had to have imagined it. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the long drive, the fog of the road. Maybe I was just overtired and seeing things. But as I slowly got out of the car, my legs wobbly beneath me, I realized one thing. I wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the darkness around me. And then I saw him, standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the light of the headlights. The same man, his black eyes staring at me with an intensity that made my stomach turn. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I jumped back into the car, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas pedal. The engine roared to life, and I sped off again, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a well-lit gas station, my hands still trembling. I haven't driven that road since. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. Something was out there, something that shouldn't have been. I've heard others talk about strange figures on that stretch of highway, sightings of shadowy figures standing in the rain, waiting for someone. I don't know if it was a ghost, a man, or something far worse. All I know is that I never want to find out.
Next story.
It was late, far past midnight, when I found myself driving alone on the stretch of highway that cuts through the mountains. I'd been on the road for hours, heading home after a visit to a family friend's cabin. The sky was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow up everything around you. My headlights cut through the fog, illuminating only a few feet ahead, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The highway seemed endless, just me, the car, and the distant echo of the wind through the trees. I'd driven this route plenty of times before, but tonight, something was different. The air felt thicker, heavier, like it was holding its breath. I didn't know if it was because I was tired or something was really off, but I couldn't shake the unease that crawled up my spine. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, like I was expecting something to appear behind me. It was around mile marker 82 when I saw the figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, maybe an animal or a tree branch, but no. As I got closer, I saw a man standing in the middle of the road. His figure was dark, but tall and unmistakable. I slowed down, my heart suddenly in my throat, as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was late, and there was no reason for anyone to be out there, especially not in the middle of nowhere. The man didn't move, just stood there staring directly at my car as I neared. I honked the horn, but he didn't flinch. My foot slammed on the brake, and I came to a stop a few feet from him. I couldn't understand it. Why wasn't he moving? Why was he just standing there like some kind of mannequin? His clothes were old, worn, and dirty, like something out of another time. His eyes, however, were what made my skin crawl. They were wide, unblinking, and white, so pale, like he had no irises, no pupils. It was like looking into an abyss. I don't know how long I sat there staring at him, but something in my gut told me I should drive away. I was terrified, frozen in place, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. It was like I knew, deep down, that something wasn't right about him, that he wasn't human. I started to roll the window up, slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. But as soon as the glass moved, I heard it. A tap. Light but deliberate, coming from the driver's side door. The man was beside my car now, his face almost pressed against the window, his eerie, empty eyes staring at me. I froze. "Help me," he said, his voice so faint I could barely hear it over the sound of my heartbeat. It was a dry, rasping whisper, like he had been calling out for days. "Please, help me." I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive off, but my body wouldn't respond. Something held me there, paralyzed in my seat. His hand was on the door now, slowly dragging down the metal with a sound that made my blood run cold. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I could only stare at the man, at the twisted, unnatural way he was looking at me. His lips parted again, and I could hear it clearly this time. That whisper, "I can't leave this place. I can't leave until I find someone else to stay." The words made no sense. But before I could even process them, he stepped back, disappearing into the fog so quickly it was like he vanished into thin air. One moment he was there, and the next, gone, like he'd never been there at all. I didn't hesitate. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding away without a second thought. My heart pounded in my chest as I sped down the highway, barely able to keep the car straight. The road ahead was a blur, the fog closing in behind me. For the next few miles, I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror. I half expected to see him chasing me, or worse, that face staring back at me from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the ever-thickening fog. But as I reached the next bend in the highway, my headlights illuminated something up ahead. Another figure. A woman, standing by the side of the road, her back to me, just like the man had been. I felt a chill creep down my spine. My hands clenched tighter on the steering wheel. My foot hesitated over the gas pedal. Should I stop? Should I keep going? I decided to slow down, but this time I wasn't getting any closer. It was like the woman was floating in place, just standing there, staring at the trees ahead of her. I couldn't see her face, but something about the way she moved, or rather didn't move, sent a shiver through me. And then I saw it. The same pale, dead-looking hand, slowly lifting, pointing into the woods. I didn't wait for any more signs. I slammed the pedal to the floor, shooting past her faster than I ever thought possible. But even as I did, I could feel her eyes on me. Her eyes, just like his, wide, unblinking, filled with that same unnatural emptiness. I don't know how long I drove, but eventually the fog began to lift. The road cleared. I was still speeding, but the urgency had faded. I could see the outline of the nearest town now, the lights twinkling in the distance. I was nearly there. I was going to make it, but as I approached the outskirts of town, my headlights fell on another figure, standing in the road. A man hunched over, like he was crouching, almost like he was waiting for something. I slammed on the brakes once again, my heart leaping into my throat. The man didn't move. He just crouched there, his face hidden beneath a dark hood, his hands held together in front of him. I tried to call out to him, but no words left my mouth. I reached for the horn, but before I could press it, something else caught my eye. There, across the street, standing near the entrance to a wooded area, was another figure, a woman. She was staring directly at me, and just like the others, her eyes were wide, her face blank. And then I realized it. They were all standing in the same places, the same spots on the road, the same pose, like they were waiting for me, waiting for someone to stop, someone to be drawn in. My foot finally reacted. I sped through the small town, not daring to look back again, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just seen. I didn't know what was real anymore, or if it even mattered. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and turned on every light. I couldn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop seeing their faces, their eyes, lingering in my mind. I haven't driven that stretch of highway since, and I'm not sure I ever will again.
Next story.
It was a humid summer evening when I decided to take the back roads home. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky that was a gradient of purples and dark blues. I was familiar with the route, a quiet two-lane road that passed through farmland and woods, cutting through the small town where I grew up. The kind of road that in the daylight felt safe, but at night it could quickly turn unsettling. But I had made this drive countless times, so I wasn't worried. I had been driving for about 20 minutes when I noticed the car in my rearview mirror. It was a beat-up sedan, its headlights cutting through the thickening dusk. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just another person on the road at this late hour. But then, the car stayed behind me, unusually close, its headlights shining like twin spotlights in my mirror. It was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I made a turn onto an even smaller stretch of road, a dirt path that ran between two tall, overgrown fences. The road was narrow, and there was barely enough room for two cars to pass each other. I hoped that would be enough to shake the car off, but it followed me. It was then that I began to notice how odd it was. The car's headlights weren't moving in the usual way. It wasn't following the natural curve of the road. It seemed to hover a little too far to the left, as if the driver was trying to stay just behind my bumper without actually passing me. I felt a chill spread across my skin, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. I could feel my pulse quickening. Something was definitely wrong. I decided to speed up, hoping that if I just drove a little faster, I'd be able to outrun this feeling. I pressed my foot down on the pedal, and the car ahead of me lurched forward, but the sedan stayed right behind me. It didn't gain on me, but it didn't fall back either. I glanced in the rear view again, but this time I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach drop. The figure in the sedan's driver's seat wasn't moving. I could make out the outline of a person slumped over the wheel, but they didn't seem alive, not in any normal sense. They were sitting perfectly still, not even swaying with the motion of the car, just frozen like a mannequin. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I instantly felt my chest tighten with panic. What the hell was happening? I'd heard about strange things happening on these back roads, stories that sounded too far-fetched to believe, people disappearing, things following them home, strange figures appearing in the dark, but I never thought it would happen to me. I needed to get off this road, fast. I pressed harder on the gas, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped forward. But the sedan was still there. It hadn't moved an inch. Its headlights were still fixed on me as if it were waiting, tracking every move I made. I started to feel the pull of my own thoughts, wondering if I was imagining things. But then, there it was again. A small, almost imperceptible flicker of movement in the rearview mirror. The person in the sedan's driver's seat had turned their head. Slowly. Too slowly. I didn't need to see any more. I swerved off the dirt path and onto the paved road again, hoping that the wider street would give me more room to shake the car off. But just as I straightened the wheel, I heard it, an ear-splitting screech of brakes, the sound of a car sliding on gravel. I didn't dare look back. The road opened up in front of me, and I kept speeding, praying that the sedan would finally turn off or disappear into the night. But the car behind me was relentless. I couldn't hear its engine, not like mine, which was roaring louder than usual as I pushed it to its limits. But I could still feel it, that eerie presence right behind me, close enough that it almost felt like the car was going to crash into my back bumper any second. I turned sharply down another road, hoping I could lose it in the winding corners of the highway, but the sedan stayed with me. It was a relentless chase. The headlights never wavered, the figure inside still motionless. That's when I saw the sign up ahead. A sharp curve. I knew the turn well. It was dangerous at high speeds. People had crashed there before, especially if they didn't know the road. But at this point, I didn't have a choice. I slammed on the brakes, swerving to the right in an attempt to cut the turn as possible. The car followed. I couldn't believe it. How was it staying with me? As I made the turn, the headlights of the sedan got even closer. I could see the edges of the vehicle now, the outline of the body. It didn't even look like a car anymore. It looked wrong. The shape was distorted, as though the vehicle was stretching and shrinking in the night air. I forced myself to look away, but my heart was racing, my hands shaking. I couldn't stop driving, couldn't slow down. I had to get away. The road twisted again, and this time I couldn't make the turn. My tires screeched, and the car skidded off the road, crashing into the brush. For a split second, everything was silent. I was thrown against the seatbelt, my head hitting the side window. I blinked, disoriented, my heart thumping in my ears. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I had crashed. But when I opened my eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The sedan was still there. It had stopped on the shoulder of the road, its headlights piercing through the fog. It was parked perfectly, just far enough away to make it look like it was waiting for something. I could hear it now, the soft hum of the engine, the sound of someone breathing, and that figure, sitting motionless at the wheel, staring directly at me. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew I couldn't stay there. With my hands shaking uncontrollably, I threw the car into reverse and hit the gas, trying to back up into the brush and away from the figure. I could see it in my rearview mirror, following me once again, impossibly close, as if it had been waiting for this moment. But no matter how far I drove, no matter how many turns I took, it was always there, right behind me. The figure never moved, and it never left.
Next story.
I still can't shake the feeling of dread that gripped me that night on Highway 61, the stretch of road that winds through the dark forests of Mississippi. I was on my way back from a business trip, heading home to New Orleans. It was late, around 2:30 a.m., and the air was thick with fog. The headlights from my car barely cut through the mist that clung to the trees like a shroud, and there was a heavy, oppressive silence that only deepened the unease gnawing at me. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that feels like something is watching you from the shadows, waiting for you to make a wrong move. The kind that makes your heart race and the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I had driven this route dozens of times, but tonight was different. I can't explain it, but something about the air felt wrong. I tried to shake it off and put my focus back on the road, but that's when I noticed her, standing by the side of the road just outside the reach of my headlights. She was tall, thin, wearing a long, flowing white dress, her dark hair hanging loosely over her shoulders. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe someone stranded in the fog, but something about the way she stood there, motionless, made me hesitate. There was no car in sight, no sign of distress. She was just standing there, staring into the fog like she was waiting for something, or someone. I slowed down as I passed her, my eyes fixed on her in the rearview mirror. The moment I did, something inside me screamed to keep going, but I couldn't. It was like my body was on autopilot, and my car started to slow even more, as if drawn to her presence. My gut twisted, warning me to keep driving, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over to the shoulder, just a little ahead of where she was standing, my tires crunching on the gravel. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought she was in trouble. Maybe I was just hoping I could help. Whatever the reason, I didn't want to leave her alone out there in the cold, silent darkness. I turned off the engine, and as soon as the car was still, I opened the door. The night air hit me like a brick wall, cold and damp. I started to walk toward her, my steps tentative at first. She didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me as I drew closer. I tried to call out to her, asking if she needed help, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the fog, and I couldn't hear anything over the pounding of my own heartbeat. By the time I reached her, I was standing just a few feet away. She was still staring into the fog, her back turned to me. The chill that had settled deep inside me was unbearable, but I couldn't walk away. Not yet. I reached out to tap her on the shoulder, but the moment my hand touched her, something strange happened. A jolt of electricity shot through my fingers, freezing me in place. I yanked my hand back, feeling a coldness that went beyond anything I had ever experienced. That's when she turned. Her face, it wasn't human, at least not in the way I had imagined. Her eyes were black as coal, empty and hollow, as though nothing existed behind them. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips parted in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile of something ancient and malicious. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry and my body wouldn't move, My brain was screaming at me to run, but I was paralyzed. Her gaze locked onto mine, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something, a flash of something I can't explain. It was like I saw a history of pain, of death, of something that had been lost to time. Then she spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said, her voice a whisper that seemed to carry on the wind. It wasn't a voice that belonged to a human. It was cold and empty, like the voice of someone who had been dead for decades. I took a step back, and that's when the ground beneath me seemed to shift. The fog swirled around us, thickening until I could barely see her anymore. But I could feel her presence, like she was surrounding me, closing in. Suddenly, there was a noise, a soft rustling, almost like something moving through the underbrush. My heart hammered in my chest as I scanned the trees, hoping to see someone or something, anything, just to break the tension. That's when I saw them. Shapes, figures, dozens of them, standing in the shadows of the trees, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They were watching me, and the fear that gripped me was unlike anything I had ever felt. I realized then that they weren't just watching me, they were waiting for me. I turned back to the woman, but she was gone, vanished into the fog as though she had never been there. I could still feel the coldness of her touch on my skin and the weight of the eyes in the trees. It was as if they were all part of something much bigger, something ancient, and I was the prey. I didn't think. I didn't stop to second guess myself. I turned and ran back to my car as fast as I could, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just started the engine and slammed my foot on the gas pedal, tearing away from that stretch of road as fast as the car could go. But the fear didn't leave me. It clung to me like the fog, and no matter how fast I drove, it felt like something was following me, something I couldn't escape. I didn't stop again until I reached New Orleans, but even now, I don't drive those roads anymore. I've heard stories since then of others who've encountered that same woman, those same figures in the fog. Some say she's a ghost, others say she's something older, something evil. I don't know what she is, but I know one thing. The next time I see her, it won't be by chance.
Next story.
It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world felt like it was holding its breath. The streets were nearly empty, and the usual hum of city life had quieted down as I left my late shift at the diner. I had worked longer than usual that night, which meant I was driving home later than I wanted to. I was tired, my eyes heavy, but I wanted to get home. I was looking forward to a hot shower and finally getting some sleep. My usual route home was a long, winding road that passed through a forested area. I'd driven it countless times, and though it was a little creepy at night, I never thought twice about it. The streetlights were few and far between, and the trees seemed to swallow the road whole, but it wasn't anything that could scare me. I turned the corner, and there it was, the stretch of highway I needed to take to get home. The moon was out tonight, but the canopy of trees blocked most of its light, casting the road in a shadowy, dim glow. As I turned the corner, I glanced at my rearview mirror. There was a car behind me, but it wasn't close, just far enough to be out of my immediate concern. I didn't think much of it. I drove on, the road getting narrower and the trees darker as I moved further into the wooded area. The silence outside was broken only by the sound of the tires humming against the asphalt and the occasional chirp of crickets in the distance. The atmosphere felt like it was pressing in on me, but I was too tired to care. I was almost home. Then something strange happened. I caught a glimpse of the headlights in my rearview mirror. The car behind me wasn't just following at a distance anymore. It had gotten closer. Much closer. I didn't remember it speeding up, but I couldn't ignore the fact that it was right on my tail now, its headlights blinding in the mirror. I glanced nervously over my shoulder, but there was no sign of it in the actual view through the back window. The road behind me was empty, but in the mirror, I could still see those lights, so close. My heart started to race. I wasn't sure what to think. I turned the corner, hoping to break away, but the car stayed there, right behind me, keeping pace no matter how fast I went. I began to speed up. My foot pressed the gas pedal harder, my hands gripping the wheel. The headlights followed me, just a few feet behind, but when I dared to look again, just a quick glance, the car was gone, completely gone. I stared into the mirror, confused, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it had taken a side road, maybe it had turned off somehow, but the road behind me was completely clear. There was no sign of any car. Relieved but still shaken, I slowed down and resumed my pace. I was trying to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I had been too tired to focus properly. But then I saw it again. This time, I didn't need the mirror to tell me. I could see the headlights clearly through the windshield, so close to my car that it felt like the other driver was trying to push me off the road. The car was tailgating me so closely that I could see nothing but lights in front of me. My pulse quickened. The road ahead was narrow, and I was losing my grip on the wheel. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. I pressed down harder on the gas pedal, trying to break free from the invisible presence behind me. But no matter how fast I went, the car stayed there, just behind me, keeping up with my every move, matching my speed as if it were glued to my bumper. I didn't dare look back. I turned onto another winding road, hoping to throw it off, but the car was still there. The headlights never flickered, never slowed. I swerved, nearly losing control of the car, but the lights remained in my mirror. My hands were slick with sweat now, and my breath was coming in sharp gasps. I didn't know what to do. I tried to calm myself, tell myself it was some kind of trick, some odd illusion caused by my exhaustion. But it wasn't working. The lights were real. The presence was real. And then as I rounded a sharp curve, the headlights disappeared once again. I glanced back, half expecting to see the car gone, but it wasn't just gone. It was in front of me. The car had somehow passed me, without a sound, without any sign of moving. The lights were blinding, and the car was too close, right in front of me now, almost blocking the entire road. It didn't seem to have any intention of moving. I slammed my foot on the brakes, swerving to the side of the road, narrowly avoiding a crash. I pulled over, heart hammering in my chest, and when I dared to look again, the car was gone. Just gone. I sat there for a long moment, my hands shaking, my chest tight. I couldn't understand what had just happened. I was sure I had seen the car, heard it, felt it behind me, but now it was as though it had never existed. I took a deep breath and tried to calm my racing heart, looking around to make sure there was nothing else waiting for me on the dark road. There was nothing. No cars, no headlights, just the eerie quiet of the night. Eventually, I started the engine again, my hands still unsteady, and continued on my way. I kept my eyes glued to the road, every muscle tense, waiting for the next sign that something wasn't right. But nothing else happened. The rest of the drive was uneventful, as though the strange experience had never occurred at all. When I finally reached my house, I felt a strange sense of relief. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that something was watching me from that dark road. And every time I drive down that stretch again, my eyes are drawn to the rearview mirror, expecting to see those headlights lurking behind me once more.